כאן ביפו. קודם כל, אני צריך להסביר לכם, הגעתי לגור ביפו בשנה שעברה, ובגלל זה העברית שלי לא מספיק טובה לדבר איתכם בעברית על כל ההיסטוריה של הכנסייה האנגליקנית. לכן אני רוצה לדבר באנגלית. Okay?
As Paul says, I don't say anything ridiculously awful and in Hebrew and upset anyone. The Anglican Diocese today is a huge institution, and it is a Protestant denomination. And I need to just explain what that is, because it's one of the reasons that the Anglican Church grew quickly in Israel, but also why it was absent from Israel-Palestine pretty much until the 1830s. So I want to explain that because it also emphasises and explains why the Protestant Church in Europe felt the need to come and plant a church in Jerusalem, which is where the Anglican Church in Israel all began. It's a huge institution today. The Anglican Church across the world is called the Anglican Communion, and it has roughly 85 million members across the world. The majority of those are now in the African states, with numbers declining in Northern Europe and America. And it goes by different names. Some of you may have heard the term Episcopalian, or Anglican, or Anglo-Catholic. It's all the same thing, talking about the Anglican Church. And it's home to about 7,000 Anglicans in Israel, Palestine, Syria, Jordan and Lebanon. There are 28 congregations of the Anglican Church here, and they are spread out quite thinly, and the diocese operates a large number of hospitals and schools, training institutions and social welfare activities across the Middle East. And that is a historic legacy largely from how the Anglican Church came to be formed in this area of the world. The current Archbishop is here, that's Archbishop Hossam Naum. He is an Israeli Arab, and he became Archbishop last year. He is very much keen to promote interfaith dialogue and to work for peace and reconciliation as the heart of what he sees as the future of the Anglican Church in the Middle East. He succeeds Archbishop Sahel. Archbishop Sahel was Archbishop for 15 years, and it's Archbishop Sahel that has the personal connection with Jaffa, because his father served in the Anglican Church in Jaffa before it was closed in 1948. So I just want to quickly look at the diocese. They are some of the churches and institutions across the Middle East, and so you can see that it's quite a challenging area to manage, particularly when you've got to navigate the various checkpoints and language barriers and cultural barriers to hold it all together. But currently that's roughly the area that the diocese holds today. The Anglican Church in Israel-Palestine especially is small. It's one of the smaller denominations, but it's certainly got an interesting history, which is what we're going to talk about now. I want to talk and outline what I'm going to say into these four areas: Protestantism and the impact, the LSPCAJ, and I'll explain what that is when we get to it. It's a society for mission. Bishop Gobat and the Church Mission Society, and then Jaffa 1900 and beyond. So we need to understand first of all what Protestantism is. A Protestant church gets its name from a letter of protest, hence the term Protestant, Protestant, about the persecution of this man, Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther, who is the founder of the Lutheran Church, was somebody who was very concerned about what he perceived to be corruption in the Roman Catholic Church of the time. And he went to Wittenberg Cathedral and he nailed to the door 95 theses or objections to things the Roman Catholic Church were doing. Because of that, the things he said resonated with many of the public and many in the church, because in Europe at this point the church was almost entirely Roman Catholic. And you see this breakaway movement called Protestantism form and start. And very rapidly, and indeed in Luther's lifetime, it spreads across Northern Europe. Now you can boil down what Protestants believe in these things here, and I'll just quickly go through them. They believe in scripture, tradition and reason. So they don't just take the Bible, they take traditions of the church and the understanding that humanity brings in trying to explain these things. Protestants generally have a more literal understanding of the Bible. So for example, prophecy, they will look for a more literal application. They will look for a more literal application on how you should live your life according to what the Bible teaches. They very strongly believe, and this was key in Luther's time, that it's not the church's job to tell you what to think. And in the Roman Catholic Church, there were set teachings and understandings, and you couldn't deviate from them. Luther said that was wrong, and that actually you should be able to interpret the Holy Scriptures for yourself. This was a revelation to people at the time. You could interpret things for yourself, and you didn't need the church's interpretation of it. He encouraged people to study the Bible, the Scriptures, to not just pray or receive the sacraments like Holy Communion or baptism, but actually read things for themselves. Previously, if you'd gone to church, you would have been told what the passage was, told what it meant, and you'd have gone away, and that would have been it. Well, Protestants, the movement said, no, you need to be looking at the Holy Scriptures yourself. They said the teachings of the faith should be available to all, not just the clergy. That's fairly self-explanatory. And that they had a reformed view or a new understanding of the sacraments of the church, like Holy Communion, and what they meant. I won't go into that because we'll be here until 11 o'clock this evening. They believed very much that Christianity was about a personal, one-to-one relationship with God, and that your eternal salvation depended on that personal relationship. And they were more focused, and this is why it's so relevant to what we're talking about now, on mission and evangelism by teaching. Because of that, they felt the need to go and spread the good news of Christianity in all parts of the world, and a particular focus would become Jerusalem and the Middle East in general. And of course, more well known is they rejected a lot of Catholic, what we call dogma in the church, which is official teaching or understanding surrounding people such as Mary, purgatory, which is kind of like hell, sin, and the saints. So it's, I've given a very simple kind of overview of Protestantism there, but it is the reason why it spread quickly, because it caught on, and a lot of people liked the idea that they could be free to kind of work their own way forward and not have to suffer under all the rules of the Catholic Church. That's a simple way of explaining it. But what it did lead to was that very quickly they realised that when it came to presence in the Middle East, they had none at all. Prior to the 1800s, there was no Anglican church in Israel. There was not even a building, there was not even a single minister. And this is where the Anglican Church begins, with the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, which later becomes the London Jewish Society, and then today is known as the Church's mission amongst Jewish people.
and they still exist and are based in Israel. So, another term that I just want to talk about is a term that some of you may know. It's the term Yehudim Meshachim. Have you heard that term? Yehudim Meshachim? Okay. Messianic Jew. Jewish Christian. Hebrew believer. Jewish believer. There are all kinds of names for those who identify as such. Basically what it means, it's a Jewish person who has come to accept Christianity as the faith they wish to practice. My background is my family are Jewish, so I fall under one of those labels. But I'm going to use the term Messianic Jew because it's the most commonly used term around the world. I'm aware that for some it's not a pleasant term. I apologise, but because it's the most commonly used term, that's the one I'm going to use. In 1948, there were 23 Messianic Jewish families that identified as such in Israel, and in 2015 there were 9,000. So it is a growing movement, and largely the existence of Messianic Jews in Israel, Palestine, is because of the London Jewish Society. So it begins with this man, Christian Friedrich Frey. He was originally born Joseph Samuel Levy, and he came to faith in Christianity and was baptized, and basically said, you know, the church, the Protestant church, needs to have a foothold in Israel. So he went to the London Mission Society and convinced them that this is what he felt was necessary to actually go out and establish the church there. And there are two very distinct reasons that drive the whole thing. It was the belief of the period that the restoration of Israel, and the Christian understanding at this time was that means the Jewish people returning to live in the land of Israel, and the Jewish acceptance of Yeshua as Messiah were key to the second coming of Christ. So this drives the mission for the Protestants to come into Israel. Now, as much as he was a skilled preacher and teacher, he was hopeless with money, and he amounted huge debts and was not a particularly good administrator. And so the church intervened, the Anglican Church intervened in 1815, that's the Church of England, and basically they pay off his debts, and in return he resigns and goes elsewhere, and they make the London Jewish Society part of the Anglican Church, and the Archbishop of Canterbury its patron. And from there you start to see things moving forward. They proposed to come out to Israel and to Jerusalem and to provide assistance to Jews who were returning to live in the Holy Land. And primarily that was done by schools and hospital provision, because many of the Jewish immigrants would arrive and there was no such thing as a social welfare system at this point. And so they would provide these services. And of course, whilst they're providing these services, there would be Christian literature, and if people asked about the Christian faith, they would talk about it. It's one of the reasons that the rabbis in Jerusalem eventually get fed up with this, and they say to the Jewish community, if any of you go and use their services, you'll be excommunicated. And what that meant for them is if you were living in Jerusalem at this period, you were often supported financially by Jews from across the world in what they called a common allowance. Well, if you went and used the services of the Christian hospital, then your allowance would be stopped. And in fact, many had to leave their communities. So it begins this kind of growing tension between the rabbis and the missionaries, which is what they were in Jerusalem. But this man moves on, and we come to the Reverend John Nicolason, who really did put the Anglican Church on the map here, and it's through him that you find that Christ Church, which still stands today in the old city, is built, and he really does start to spread out and look for options for the Anglican Church across Israel. And he falls out often with the British consul because of what they're doing, and some of the activities don't line up with what the British government at the time felt should be going on. But the focus here was to get a church built. And the reason for that was because the Protestant church felt that they were not on an equal footing with the other denominations. So the Armenians had churches, the Roman Catholics had churches, the Greek Catholics had churches. We don't have anything. And so they wanted to get this church built. And Christ Church Jerusalem was built, paid for by the London Jewish Society, as the first Anglican church in Jerusalem. And in fact it is the oldest Protestant church in Israel. And so Nicolaitsen really did move things forward. The other thing that really concerned the Anglican Church at the time was they didn't have a bishop. Now there was already a bishop of Jerusalem, that was the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. So they said, well, we need a bishop in Jerusalem, which is why Archbishop Hassan is not called the Bishop of Jerusalem today, he's called the Bishop in Jerusalem. So as not to offend the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, this was supported by the London Jewish Society and also by King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, who basically puts up the money for supporting the ministry here and for the creation of an Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. And the way they worked it out was this. They said the first archbishop can be English Anglican, but then the next one will be from somewhere we would now call Germany, and then after him it goes back to someone from England, and then back to Germany, like a ping-pong ball going back and forth. And that's what happened. So they said, we want an Anglican bishop, and they found someone for that very role in the form of this man, Michael Solomon Alexander. He was a controversial choice. For many today, he's still a controversial choice because he was a Jewish rabbi who converted to Christianity. He was born in an area of what is now Germany, and he was trained in Orthodox Judaism. At 16, he became a teacher of the Talmud in the German language, and when he came to England, he performed the role of a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, for the Jewish communities here, and he was appointed a rabbi in England. When he came, he, by his own admission in his later writings, said he didn't really understand Christianity, didn't know what the New Testament was, but it's while he was in England and a rabbi at Norwich and then to Plymouth, where he married his wife, he became acquainted with a Church of England minister, and in return for giving this minister lessons in Hebrew, the minister would explain to him the New Testament, and in 1825 he converted after 4 years of thought to Christianity. He becomes the first Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem in 1841 and is led in via the Jaffa Gate to Jerusalem in 1842. He did great things for the small community of Anglicans there. He actually had a good relationship with the rabbis, and dialogue was good, but he succumbed to ill health, and like many of the European people that came out to Israel, those of you who lived in Jaffa a long time, imagine living in Jaffa without the aircon in the summer. A lot of them couldn't cope with the heat, which is why many of them in fact used to go back into mainland Europe during that period. And sadly for Solomon Alexander, he just couldn't cope and died. Now, in his tenure, which was only a few years, he built a hospital, a church, a college for converts, a school for training, a book depository, schools for boys and girls, a cemetery, and what he called a school of industry, which was to support those who had left the Jewish faith and found themselves destitute. That, however, would all change with this man, Samuel Gobat, who was the second archbishop, who was about as different from Solomon Alexander as you can get. And this is where you see the split occur between the Anglican London Jewish Society, today called CMJ, and the rest of the Anglican Church. He was the choice of the King of Prussia. He was actually Swiss. He was fluent in Arabic, Biblical Hebrew and Latin, but very much his model of doing things was not to focus on the Jewish people, but instead to focus on the existing Christians living in the Holy Land. In fact, this is what he said before he came out to live in Jerusalem, that he's come to evangelize the fallen, ignorant Greeks, Romanists, meaning Roman Catholics, Armenians and Turks. He considered Muslims out of bound. In modern terms, we would call in England Bishop Gobat a poacher. And that's a term in the church used to refer to a minister who basically kind of encourages, I'll say, members of other churches to come and join your own. That's what he did, and in fact this became such an issue that the Foreign Office and Lord Palmerston and the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1851 basically had to write to him and say, you need to stop doing this because you're upsetting the Armenians and the Roman Catholics and the Greek Catholics. His answer was, but if they come to me, then what am I to do? And he basically said that they're not getting any teaching in their churches. They want to learn the Bible, and if they come and they become Anglicans, then I'm not going fishing for them, they're coming to me. He was a Church Mission Society man through and through, and a Church Mission Society is important for the Anglican Church because it's a springboard for everything that happens next. They arrived in 1851, they challenged the monopoly of the London Jewish Society as the only Protestant church there. And indeed they began to encroach on all their activities, including those ministering amongst the Jewish people. And over the next 75 years, it grew to become the largest Protestant landowner in Israel, Palestine, and other parts of the Middle East. And in fact, the Church Mission Society only turned over control of these properties to the Diocese of Jerusalem, which is the Anglican Church in the Middle East, in the 1970s. But they had huge property and investments they made. The problem with the Christchurch building was that Bishop Gobat wanted it to be the centre of the new Anglican diocese. And without running down a rabbit hole, all I'll say is there was a disagreement, I'm putting it politely, and that disagreement meant that effectively CMJ is now said hands off, we're going to do our thing, and the wider Anglican Church had to go and do their thing. And that kind of sense of disagreement has lasted over the years. It's much better today, but there are still some issues. In the credit to Bishop Gobat, he did actually push forward with the establishment, and he encouraged local Arab congregations, Christian congregations, to become part of the Anglican Church, and you saw this huge explosion of churches across Israel, Palestine, and building of schools, and in Jerusalem, St. George's College was built as the cathedral in 1899, and it's really because of the push that Bishop Gobat gives to actually really establish the footing of the Anglican Church that you see the many institutions that you will see today. He was very skilled at that. He was very skilled at building congregations, and supported by the Church Mission Society, he did just that, which is why the Anglican Church is so big here today. I'm aware that I'm running out of time. All I'll say in conclusion, because I need to round off, is where we are today. Anglican Church of St. Peter in Jaffa in Yafet Street. Closed in 1948, when most of the Christian community fled, and has remained closed since. It was built in 1922.
and supported by money from the Church Mission Society. We are intending to reopen it. We currently worship in the Lutheran Church in Jaffa, but we hope that in the future we'll be able to open the building up for you to come and have a look around. We can't do it at the moment because the tower you can see is actually unsafe, but when we do, then do feel free to get in touch and we'll show you around. It wasn't open very long. It's a beautiful building and a legacy of the fact that even as far as Jaffa, which became key to CMS's activities, you know, that we're still here. So thank you very much, and any questions?